Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. And thank you very much for making it so quickly. I know it's not enough time to catch up with people and eat the food, but thank you very much for making the effort to get back on time. We've got another packed, but I think really interesting agenda there. You'll see we've got various speakers on it. You can read it yourself. You've got it in your pack, so I don't intend to go through it. But it looks to be as equally important, as equally as interesting as this morning. So, in order that we can run on time, I'm going to introduce the first speaker, which is Simon Brazier from Investec Asset Management. You already heard I worked 16 years for GA. I had 8 years at Investec. So all the firms I've worked for in the past are here, and a very enjoyable year too. A great firm, and Stuart and Simon's fund is one which I know has gone. I think the OIC is now up to over 800 million, isn't it? So it's grown exponentially over the last few years. So and he made his name previously at Schroders. You might remember him, and indeed at Freedom as well. So without further ado. Thank you
very much. Afternoon, everyone. So I'm talking apparently we're finding sustainable alpha from UK stocks. That's not really what actually I'm going to talk about. What I really want to do is talk a bit about what's going on in the world, how that relates to UK equities, and then how we're positioning that in the fund. Since the end of 2013, I've had a very sort of clear view with clients about equities generally, in particularly UK. And I'm not one of those fund managers who was always glass half full. Because actually 2009 to 2013, it was very simple. Buy equities, forget about the macro, valuations were very cheap, opportunities across all sectors, we were going to make money for our clients. And I'll show you a chart a bit later where it almost shows you historically that if you bought markets when less than 10 times PE, you were guaranteed to make money for your clients. Of course, no one wanted to buy back then, they thought it was mad. Since the end of 2013, we've all got a lot more positive, and yet I've been a bit more negative since then. And I've had a very clear view since then, which is actually the macro backdrop means it's going to be quite difficult to make money from equities from here. We'll talk a bit more about it, but top line growth for companies is going to be very muted. Valuations are now relatively full, 16, 17 times earnings for the market. Some of the best companies are now trading relatively expensively. Expect more volatility. You know, it's interesting, the last 2 years, if you came down from Mars and looked at the UK equity market, you did 1.2% and 1% in 14 and 15. Yet for those of us who've lived through it, it's been certainly a lot more volatile than that within years. And I'll talk about at the end how actually I do think we can make money for clients from here. So look, I'm not going to, there may be a bit of time for questions at the end, but the reality is that it is difficult. My personal view is that there's just still too much debt in the world, and particularly in the developed world, consumers, governments, banks are having to delever. I mean, it was ironic that you had a long period of time where George Osborne was telling you, actually, we need to do QE, the banks need to rebuild their balance sheets. And in the same TV interview, you'd have Vince Cable, the business secretary, would come on and go, the banks need to lend, the banks need to lend. The reality is, you can't do both. You can't rebuild your balance sheet and use your capital to lend. You can do both, but you can't do them both aggressively. And so the banks have been, and will continue, particularly in Europe, to rebuild their balance sheets over the next few years. Commodity price volatility. Actually, this should have been, and has probably been, a bit of a boon to the consumer. I think the consumers continue to grow over this period, despite the fact things are relatively weak. And part of that is because they're filling up at the pumps, it's been cheaper. But from here, do you believe commodity prices can get lower, lower, lower? Maybe more difficult. QE. I'm not going to talk a lot about QE, but if I would happily have a debate afterwards with anyone who believes that the transmission mechanism of QE into the real economy works. My personal view is it's great for reducing yields, pushing up asset prices, but actually the explosion of the money supply, in my mind, has just offset the massive drop in the velocity of circulation of money. It hasn't really led into banks lending, consumer spending, businesses investing. That has not been a direct result of QE, and so I do worry about where we are from that point of view, and obviously Brexit, which we may come on to. Now the macro environment does remain challenging. In the UK, actually, funnily enough, things had been looking pretty good. UK GDP growth up there with the US nearly, consumer confidence high, unemployment under control, down to 5%, inflation under control. Here, George Osborne, 2019, these were the previous growth numbers. I'll explain in a minute why the numbers are slowing. Yeah, potentially, according to the IMF, we'd had an annual budget surplus by 2020 almost, just as he was going to be standing up for election as Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister. He would have got corporation tax down to 17%. The UK would have been humming. Unfortunately, we've had Brexit. And in the short term, my personal view from a stock market point of view, yes, there will be issues about individual sectors. If we were to leave Europe, the biggest issue for me is the economy. Now, these are the UK, lots of numbers, and apologies, but these are the UK GDP numbers that came out in March from the Office of Budget Responsibility. UK GDP is just made up of 4 components. Those of you who did economics, you may remember the formula C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Household consumption plus business investment plus government expenditure plus net trade. The bottom 2 you can ignore. Look at them. They're tiny. One, they're both tiny contributions to GDP, less than 10% each of GDP, and the numbers are minimal. What is really driving GDP at the moment is household consumption, which is over 2/3 of GDP, and business investment. So the 2% in 2016 is made up of roughly 60% of the 2.4 and 20-odd% of the 2.6. Now this number here, the 2.6 for 2016, has just been downgraded from nearly 8% by the Office of Budget Responsibility, because in Q4 we saw business investment growth go to 0 basically. The risk for me around Brexit is business investment. That was growing at 5 to 10% per annum in the forecast. And companies were starting to invest, particularly here in the UK, in the environment I showed you. But I promise you, I met nearly 300 companies last year. We're meeting companies every single day of the week. They are not going to invest, one, until the result of the referendum, and afterwards it becomes impossible. EasyJet will leave the UK within 6 months if we vote to leave. Carrick McCall cannot have a European point-to-point airline operating where they are not part regulatory-wise of the European Common Aviation Agreement, where she can land wherever she wants, fly over any countries, and bid for slots with Air France in Charles de Gaulle. Simple as that. They will be out. They'll be sitting next to Ryanair, and Mr O'Leary and Carrick McCall will be sitting next to each other in Ireland. And other businesses will be the same. Will Nissan invest further in their plants in the UK if they have no certainty of where they can sell their cars? Because at the moment they can sell them anywhere in Eastern Europe with no trade barriers, etc. That business investment number has been incredibly important, and the Conservative government has really targeted trying to get that business investment growth going because they knew it was a big component of GDP. So that to me is, if it does happen, be aware it's not about markets. We will see a slowing economy potentially. Now this is a chart about valuation. This has an R-squared of 0.81, so if you're an economist, this has a, Mr Harford's about to speak after, he will hopefully nod and tell you that is quite a high correlation for a set of data. What that shows you, if you look, is the starting PE for the UK equity market and what the return is per annum for the next 10 years. So if you buy the market on less than 10 times earnings, you are pretty much guaranteed to make, you've never not made, almost 10% per annum. And that was the point we were at in 2008-9. Today, you buy the market on 16, 17 times PE, you have never made double-digit returns, really, from here. Starting valuation is by far the highest correlation with equity market returns. It's an old adage, my father once told me, called buy low, sell high. It does seem to work. But in equity markets, it's been proven correct. So, and not only that, what is the valuation opportunity you are being given in today's market? I don't think it's particularly attractive. Some of you will be considering, you probably may have fallen slightly into that trap of owning a lot of UK mid-cap growth funds, which are having a terrible time this year, while the value funds do very well. But the point I'd like to make about value is just be careful. This shows you, on a 10-year view, annoyingly it's MSCI sectors rather than FTSE, but it shows you which are the sectors that trade along their long-term 10-year average. It's mining, oils, financials, and if you could see individual sectors, it'd be food retailing in there. Now that is what most typical value funds are chock-a-block full of, and who are doing very well this year. My concern about value is often Warren Buffett says, don't buy fair businesses on with wonderful prices, buy wonderful businesses with fair prices. The value investor will often say, you often get a chance to buy wonderful businesses on wonderful prices. 1999-2000, people like Neil Woodford made their career around buying wonderful businesses on wonderful prices. The world was looking over here at TMT. Everyone was trying to value stocks on eyeballs and clicks and huge growth that never happened. And the clever value investors were looking over here. Because the bottom of this chart in 1999-2000 was tobacco, it was consumer staples. VAT on 8% dividend yield with a 9 times PE multiple. So you had a great opportunity to buy what are very good businesses. 2008-9, the value investor should have been looking at this chart, which they were, because you could find financials, life insurance, engineering companies, general retailing in the UK, cyclical businesses, house builders on really low valuations. You could buy some great businesses on very low valuations. Today, I would argue the opportunity to buy mining, oils, banks and food retailing is not as attractive. You're not being offered fantastic businesses. These businesses are very capital intensive. They require a lot of capital to grow. They're particularly mining and oil, are quite cyclical in terms of their reliance on the commodity cycle. I don't think today you are being provided with the opportunity to buy great businesses on great prices. So in my portfolio in particular, we are finding some restructuring recovery opportunities, but it's companies more like Balfour Beatty, Rentokil, Vodafone, Royal Bank of Scotland. Actually, decent businesses that have been run poorly historically that should be able to recover, rather than relying on the oil price recovering or the iron ore price recovering. And volatility. This is a chart that a lot of my clients ask me for and use with their clients, because equity markets are volatile. It's just a fact. These show, we're lucky in the UK, we have equity market returns going all the way back to 1899 in the Barclays Equity Gilt Study. So I've taken every single year of equity returns since 1899, and I've said, how many years has the market done 0 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 6%? Now these are real numbers, so they're after inflation, and the long-term return for UK equities after inflation, taken off, since 1899 is 5%. If you add on inflation, it's about 8. But if you look at this chart, you don't get a beautiful normal distribution around 5. Actually, going back 100 odd years, the chances of you getting a plus 25% year or a minus 15% year are pretty similar to the plus 5 year. The range of outcomes for our clients is quite wide. And a lot of people have it in their head, particularly in the last 10 years, when we've seen equity markets being flat to up every single year, that this is normal. I would say we've been in a very abnormal environment where equity markets have been somewhat overtaken by what's been going on in the global macro environment and the fact that we had a huge global financial crisis. If you believe we are back to somewhat of a more normalised environment, look back at the 70s, look back at the 50s. These are environments when you did make money, but actually in the 70s, that minus 50 year there was the year before the plus 50 year here. It was difficult. And my personal view is we're going to see more volatility. We may have more muted returns from equities, but expect volatility. And for me as a fund manager, I'm going to have to get used to that. So, how do we make money for clients in this type of environment? In an environment where, as I said, please don't tell your clients they're going to make money because the top line growth of companies is going to be very strong. It's not. Global GDP will be lucky to be 3%. The developed world, where most of our equity returns come from, is well less than 3% return economic growth at the moment. To find companies with more than 5% organic growth is very, very difficult. So if there's no top line growth, are we going to get good margin, good profit expansion? Well, most companies have spent the last 10 years improving their margins. They've all refinanced their debt at low levels, they've restructured their cost bases. Corporate profits as a percentage of GDP have never been so high. So I'm not expecting companies to suddenly improve all their profit margins and make us money. And as I showed you, I think valuations are relatively full. We're not going to make money because suddenly the market goes from 16 times earnings to 32 times earnings. So it's going to be quite tricky. So when we look at companies, we look at these three factors. And one of these factors is the key factor for us, capital allocation, that I think has basically been ignored by investors for a long period of time and is going to come back to the fore. So of course we want to find companies with great business models that can grow their profits on a 3 to 5 year view. Yes, we want a good financial model, a company that can turn its profits into cash. But the point is, what does the company then do with the cash flow that belongs to clients? Because up until now, this is how we think about it. We look at what we call free cash flow to equity. The amount of cash the company generates that belongs to shareholders, to my clients. It doesn't belong to the tax man, it's after we pay the tax. It doesn't belong to the debt holder, it's after we paid interest on the debt. It doesn't belong to the pensioners, we paid the pensioners out. And there are some companies that don't make any money on this basis when you actually add it up. They haven't got any cash to return to shareholders. BP at the moment is paying its dividends out of its debt, not out of its cash flow. But for those good companies that can do that, they then have a choice. And for the last 10 years, a lot of people, because a lot of you have been putting your money with income fund managers, have demanded all that money back to your clients straight away as dividends. Or in the US, we've seen that money come back to shareholders as share buybacks. That is fine to a degree. But as you know, it's very difficult to grow if you do not invest in your business. You'll know from your own businesses, you've got to reinvest some of your cash flow. And the types of businesses, particularly in a low-growth environment now, we think are ones that can reinvest their cash flow for growth. And I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. In a low-growth world, the rising tide is not going to lift these ships anymore. Valuations are not going to lift the ships. Companies are going to have to do it themselves. And those top two boxes suddenly become important in what is a difficult world. So let me just give you an extreme example of capital allocation. Here are two companies, Booker and Tesco. I assume you've mostly heard of most of them. You would all heard of Tesco, UK food retailing company. Booker is a cash and carry business, but is also effectively one of the UK's largest wholesaling food distribution businesses. It distributes food to hotels, corner shops, prisons, cinemas, etc. Now look at the difference in their share price. They haven't got different share prices because they're in different sectors. I promise you, the competition in food wholesaling, where Booker is, where margins are between 1% and 2%, is much more aggressive than it is in the supermarkets, where up until recently, Tesco's had 6% operating margins for 20 years. So it's not because they're in different sectors. It is this point here, it's about capital allocation. For 10 years, Terry Leahy and Phil Clark after him took all the great cash flow that Tesco generated and reinvested it in space growth and overseas expansion. And absolutely killed returns. It was a very bad decision. It was a very bad use of your clients if they own Tesco's cash flow, because returns just did this. Because in the UK, we're now all going online. We do not need 100,000 square foot supermarkets anymore. And actually, the US, Fresh and Easy, which was their proposition in the US, the Koreans, didn't quite take to the same Tesco model that we did in the UK. So he killed his business. Yet, Booker, Charles Wilson, who runs Booker, decided not to increase space in Booker. Actually, every Booker store has become smaller, and he built the only, today, food online distribution platform for wholesaling that can deliver frozen, chilled and fresh food anywhere from John O'Groats to Land's End profitably. So when last year Budgens and Londis, 1,800 Budgens and Londis stores came up for sale, which were loss-making, he bought them for £40 million. He makes a 3% margin, delivering to 2,300 other corner shops across the UK, 800 million of revenue at Budgens and Londis, 3% margin, £24 million. So just alone, 24 million on a 40 million investment, most you can work out is nearly a 60% return on your investment. Not only that, he sold the freeholds for some of the London-based ones and has already got his money back in a year. But my question would be, instead of investing overseas and massive space growth in the UK, imagine if Terry Lee had the insight 10 years ago to actually build the UK's best online food distribution platform for consumers. Ocado would not exist. Amazon Fresh would not be able to compete in the UK. Their dominant position they had 10 years ago they lost from poor capital allocation. And so this point about capital allocation is absolutely clear. Rolls-Royce, we bought Rolls-Royce in the middle of last year, it's now last year, at £5.30, the shares were £11. They used to be run by a guy called John Rishton. He had no clue about capital allocation. One minute he'd come in and tell me the future for Rolls-Royce was in marine. The next time he'd come and tell me it's about generators. A guy called Warren East has gone in there. He grew at Arm Holdings, which is a very successful UK tech company. And he says, actually, the crown jewels of Rolls-Royce is we build engines. We build them bloody well, and we're going to continue to do that, improve productivity, get our cash flow up. Rentokil. A guy called Andy Ransom entered Rentokil 3 years ago. What do you all associate Rentokil with? Rat catching. What did Rentokil try and do for 10 years? Deliver parcels with CityLink, did tropical plants. They got rid of it all. They've gone back to rat catching. They're catching rats in the US now in terms of expanding there. And look at the share price. It has doubled in 3 years. A great business run poorly. And there's lots of examples of this. So in my portfolio, the way I try and run my fund is thinking about my end client. It's pretty simple. The top 2 boxes here are the great businesses. They make up 2/3 of the fund. They're the companies that completely fulfill the criteria of great business model, great financial model, great capital allocation. I'm pretty comfortable I can go and sit on a beach for 5 years and come back, and all those companies in the top 2 boxes, plus others, will have higher profits, higher cash flow, and higher share prices in 5 years. They sell pharmaceuticals, they sell beer, they sell tobacco, they sell food, they sell washing powder. No matter what happens, they're going to continue to grow. But we are a bit more flexible in style, and in the bottom 3 boxes, restructure recovery is more your value, quality cyclicals is more your growth, contrarian views. This bit, I'm much more valuation sensitive. The top 2 boxes should be expensive companies. My father's happy to pay a high premium to own Reckitt Benckiser that grows its cash flow at nearly 10% per annum, but not only that, has reinvested its cash flow at 23% rate of return for the last 10 years. He's happy to pay a premium for that. UK house building stocks, which I'm nearly out of, I sold most of them last year, I was paying half book value for them in 2010. You're now paying 2.5 times book value to buy Persimmon, which I've sold. The reality is, do not buy cyclical companies when they're expensive, because I have no guarantee in 5 years' time that EasyJet, a house builder, Croda, which is a chemical company, will necessarily have higher profits. And for the last 2 years, I've been selling out of quality cyclicals and finding some really interesting names, I think, in the restructuring recovery play. Lloyds, Royal Bank of Scotland, we can talk about. Balfour Beatty, not the greatest business in the world, at all. Terrible capital allocation, wrote loads of contracts at the wrong price, but a guy called Leo Quinn is now there, been there about 18 months. He used to run Delaru, and after that Kinetic. He's very focused on cash flow. He generated £357 million of cash out of that business last year from the management in the previous year. And if we can get Balfour Beatty's operating margins from 0 to only 3%, that share price will easily double. A decent business, but it was just so poorly run historically. So I've been told to do a little bit on the fund. This is the fund I took over. You can see the last 2 years, I've been running it since 15, but last year the market was down 1, was up 1, sorry, we were up 5.6. These are my numbers at Threadneedle when I was for 5 years. The bottom is the outperformance of the fund versus the market, not the market fund going up, it's the outperformance. So as of yesterday, I've been running retail funds for exactly 10 years. I took on the Schroeder UK Equity Fund on the 1st of May 2006. And I've been very boring. I've said for 10 years, all I want to do is run a consistent fund that can deliver performance through the cycle and deliver 3 to 5% outperformance per annum on a rolling 3-year basis. We've done that now for 10 years. We've done 5% per annum, nearly, and we had 1 negative year in relative returns, which was 2008. We've been very boring. We've just consistently, with a 50 to 90 stock fund, delivered that outperformance. But the reason we've been able to do it is not because I've got some special magic that means I can find these amazing companies. We're just doing what my father would expect me to do. We're owning a core position of very good businesses that you would not be embarrassed to show any of your clients. And we're using the old adage of buy low, sell high, where in 2008 and 2009 we were buying a lot of cyclical stocks low. We sold them high in 2013, 14, 15. And at the moment we've been buying a lot of restructuring recovery stocks, we think relatively low, like Rolls-Royce at £5.40, Balfour Beatty 30% lower, even Vodafone today looks quite interesting. But then having said that, what am I buying this week? My turnover is very low. I rarely buy things on a given week, but I started buying Next last week. Which actually has some decent results, were okay today. But you could buy Next today on 12 times earnings with a 7% free cash flow yield. It's going to deliver 7 to 8% of its market cap in cash this year, and it's run by one of the best capital allocators you'll ever meet, Simon Wolfson. So that's the conclusion. The macro environment is difficult. Valuation has become quite difficult as well. And so we believe focus on companies that can grow in a low growth world, can reinvest their cash flow, and have got very strong financials. Right, we've got 6 minutes, and we may want to move on, but I was told if there were some questions.
Use up all your time.
I'm happy to answer any questions on Brexit or anything else.
Could you wait for the microphone, please, sir? Thank you.
There's one more.
One of the things you mentioned there was about EasyJet if you move out of Europe. Again, our currency would actually drop and we would actually start industrialised things again. And so companies like EasyJet, whilst they would move out, there's plenty of other airlines would replace them. And the second point about things, car industry like Nissan, they sell so many cars to the UK that they're unlikely to move away from that. So I don't see the major challenges of that.
Okay. I'll just take those in turn. I mean, look, in terms of European airlines, our currency would not attract European airlines. The reality is, for example, 75% of EasyJet's flights don't even come to the UK. They're point-to-point in Europe. So if you look at the European airline industry today, the biggest, what you need to be able to compete is access to the markets. And the reality is, although we think that the UK is very important actually to most European airlines, your ability to fly from Spain to Switzerland to France, even to the UK, but that's the most important fact. And so you want, we'll see what happens, but I wouldn't argue that would bring more people. Your point about inward investment into the UK is right. The UK is the second largest economy in Europe. Us and Germany are by far the biggest, and of course people will want to continue to produce in the UK. The point I was making is that Nissan not only make cars in the UK for the UK, they make them because they're able to sell those tariff-free anywhere else in Europe. I know this is not necessarily relevant for everyone in the room, but large financial organisations are able, under what's called passporting, as long as you have a regulated entity anywhere in the European Economic Area, you can sell to clients, etc., anywhere else within that. Deutsche Bank, ironically, no one talks about this, Deutsche Bank passport themselves into Europe, including Germany, via their London subsidiary. Because actually in investment banking, 75% of, for example, derivatives clear through London. I mean, I promise you that would not be the case if we left. I mean, Stuart Gulliver, Chief Executive of HSBC, told me specifically that when they were looking to leave the UK, or thinking about whether they would put their domicile, the French were absolutely all over them. Yes, the Singaporeans, Hong Kong, but Holland, the French were like, access to the president, whatever we can do to get you into Paris, HSBC, if they've been there known, we will do. So I think there are some risks. And I accept longer term, but it's the uncertainty in that shorter term period.
Coming around the microphone, sir.
I don't know if you could, I'd like you to explain something to me, which is, as the oil price dropped in the past, when the drop in oil price took place, it actually acted as a boost to the rest of the other industrial sectors. But this time, it seems why is it dragging everything down?
I think that is an excellent question. My answer to that is actually, how much worse would it be if oil had stayed high? I mean, that's the point, actually. I think it has been a significant boost to, if you look at companies' profit margins have improved. If you look, as I mentioned earlier, the consumer has continued to remain relatively robust on the back of the drops in disposable income. I mean, there's always a debate as to whether the oil price falls because supply has massively increased. I mean, I would argue that oil is different to the mining commodity stocks. Mining commodity has huge increases in supply as capital has flown into that sector. Oil, you've also had huge fracking and the like and produce alternatives to the oil. But also, I would argue there was a demand dynamic there, as you've seen China slowing and the world slowing generally. But I think you are spot on. It's just the reality is that it's such a low growth world. It has provided some support. It's just that in a more normalised environment, you would have got a kicker to growth from say 3%, but we're coming from growth of 0, which has given us that protection. So I think you're right, but it's just from a different level. Time for one more.
If not, I've got a very... Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Given Brexit, remain, whatever, we're faced with the new living wage. Are you positive or negative on the living wage?
That's very, whatever my answer is not going to be the right answer.
You're not a politician.
No, I'm not a politician. Look, from corporate's point of view, it is a big issue for quite a lot of companies out there, and actually they are getting around it. And I'm meeting a lot of these companies, and you see all stuff in the press about them. It's easy and not giving their staff paninis anymore, but they are genuinely trying to work ways around this. And the number of hours that the big general retailers are giving their staff is going to fall. So the total they spend on wages will go up slightly, but not as much as the living wage will provide. I mean, there is a moral argument around the living wage as well, which I could debate. That's a personal view, which I accept. I agree with it. I mean, there's also, if my mother was here, who is a Southern Daily Mail True Blue Brexit Tory reader, Tory Daily Mail reader, she believes that it's attracting all sorts of immigrants into the UK, and we will have the highest wage per hour of anywhere in Europe. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that view. So there's all sorts of parts to it. But it's a moral argument rather than an economic one, because from an economic point of view, do you know what? I think you should ask the undercover economist about that. Sorry, I should have said that straight.
Not now. That one's for later, maybe.
Perfect introduction. So that's
You're doing my job for me today, which is brilliant. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
I'm really looking forward, I'm not trying to dig up him, I'm really looking forward to the next speaker, Tim Harford. I don't know if anyone's read it, he's written books. The most read one is The Undercover Economist. I'm told reliably the average age is someone around 18 who reads that at university. He writes weekly in the Financial Times and presents a radio programme on Radio 4 called More or Less. And is it true it used to be more listened to in the Archers until Rob Titchener came along? Those Archers, this is probably not, that fell on deaf ears. But I shall hand over to Tim, looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Simon. I think I might break the tradition. I'm supposed to be talking about how to see into the future. And I thought I might talk about how to see into the future. I know it's a radical step. But if I'm going to talk about how to see into the future, that means I need to talk about two of my favourite economists, who are both enthusiastic economic forecasters, and about what happens to them. Now, one of them I think will need no introduction. His name was John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist of the 20th century. Even today, economists split themselves up into the Keynesians and the other lot. The other economist, less famous today, but in his time, I think he was the most famous economist on the planet. In fact, when Keynes was being introduced by the Wall Street Journal to an American audience, they were trying to describe who this John Maynard Keynes fellow was. There was a very simple comparison. Well, they said, well, John Maynard Keynes, he's sort of like England's Irving Fisher. These two great academics, Fisher and Keynes, had a lot in common. They were both active in the first half of the 20th century. Fisher, about 15 years older than Keynes. Both stars at university, won prizes for everything. And Keynes won prizes for maths. Fisher actually won prizes for classics, for maths, for rowing. He was this great strapping fellow with a moustache and a goatee beard. He actually wrote a book called How to Live, a diet and exercise manual, sold 500,000 copies. I mean, we need more ambition from our economists these days. He was a fitness guru, and he won prizes also for debating. They were both actually incredibly gifted speakers. They were very persuasive, charismatic men. Like, Keynes didn't win prizes for debating, but he once gave a speech that was witnessed by a Canadian diplomat called Douglas LePan. And Douglas LePan later wrote, "This is the most beautiful creature I have ever seen. Is this an angel or a human being?" You may be getting the same view right now, I don't know. But Keynes had that effect on people, and both Keynes and Fisher, also great writers. They wrote these polemic books, bestsellers, they were journalists, they wrote newspaper columns, they're very widely followed. But, and of course, both tremendously influential macroeconomists, the two most influential macroeconomists of their day. But that's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is Keynes and Fisher's forecasting record. Because they were both enthusiastic forecasters, as I mentioned, and they were both enthusiastic investors. They both thought that their ability to forecast what the economy would do would help them make money, and to some extent to help the people they advised also make money. So let me tell you how that worked out for them. Fisher initially had trouble with his investments simply because he didn't really have any money to invest. So Fisher, before he went to Yale, the week he went up to Yale, his father died of tuberculosis. So he had to work his way through his studies at Yale, pay his fees, support himself, but also support his mother and his siblings. And he knew what it was like to not have a lot of money. But fairly soon after he graduated, Irving managed to get hold of a serious amount of cash. And any of you who are wondering how he did it, I recommend his approach, really foolproof. He married somebody rich. You might want to try that if it's not too late. It's never too late, let's face it, it's never too late to marry somebody rich. Now, Fisher married Margaret Hazard. She was the heir to a laundry and detergent fortune. She and her sister, the two heiresses. And they had this grand wedding. They had a wedding cake about the size of this lectern here. 3 priests, hundreds of guests, great feast. And then they went to a 14-month honeymoon. 14-month honeymoon, the days. They toured Europe. And when they returned, they found that Margaret's father, Irving's new father-in-law, had built them a mansion in New Haven, Connecticut. So Irving could begin his time as a professor at Yale from suitable luxury to his proper mansion. So that's all very well. So now Irving has money to invest. But that wasn't enough for him. He was a proud man. He wanted to be able to make his own money. And he made it in various ways. So I mentioned the book, How to Live, best-selling book. He also, little known fact, invented the precursor to the Rolodex. And I can see some of you, at least old enough to remember what a Rolodex actually was. So Irving invented this thing called the index visible for storing business cards and storing filing. And it was a tremendous success. Pretty soon they had this huge factory churning out this product, and then there was a merger. Irving's company was taken over by Remington Rand, and Irving was on the board of directors, and he had stock options, and he wrote back to a childhood friend, said, "We are all making a lot of money." He also started to collect inflation statistics, because that was fundamental to some of Irving's academic theories. You needed to understand the price level, you needed to know what was happening to inflation, and this is 100 years or so ago. Governments just weren't collecting decent inflation numbers. So Irving set up what is called the Index Number Institute, and for over a decade, the Index Number Institute is gathering price data and analysing it to help Irving with his academic theories. But then, of course, he realises, well, this is a commercially valuable product. So he's selling price data to analysts, and then later on, he's syndicating it to the newspapers. And of course, with his price data, he also sells his opinions about how to invest. And he is syndicated, he is read across the United States. So what does Irving think? How should the average American invest his or her money? Well, Irving was a fan of equities, which was not particularly usual 100 years ago. And he was a technology bull. But Irving believed that radical improvements in technologies such as bulk chemical processing, internal combustion engine, electricity, the electric motor, the dynamo. These sorts of technologies would lead to huge productivity improvements in American manufacturing, which, by the way, he was completely right about that. And therefore, investors should basically borrow as much as they could and buy stocks on margin, which is what Irving did. And so, 1921, 1922, 1923, this is looking like a pretty clever strategy. Irving is making money, the people who are reading his columns are making money, word spreads, and he buys a car, then he buys a bigger car, then he buys an even bigger car, he gets a chauffeur, and in 1928, he renovates the family mansion. And as he's standing there admiring the work with his son, he turns to his son and he points out that this money didn't come from your grandfather. This money didn't come from the family money. This is my money. I made this money to invest. And that was important to him. It was a matter of pride. So that's Irving, 1928. We'll come back to him. What about John Maynard Keynes? Well, Maynard Keynes, he is the ultimate insider. He, during the First World War, was currency trading on behalf of the British Empire. Now, you're really going to understand how the markets work if you do that. And after the war, he engages in various activities. He publishes pamphlets and polemics and so on. But one of the things he does is he turns to friends and family members who have money, and he says, let me invest this cash in the currency markets. Now, I'm John Maynard Keynes, by the way. What can go wrong? And remember, Keynes is a very persuasive man. He's revolutionizing macroeconomics. He's helping develop economic statistics in the UK. He really knows what's going on. And of course, he had this job as a currency trader. He understands the markets. And so he gathers in a good-sized fund and he starts to invest it, and pretty soon he made a fortune. And in the early 1920s, Keynes is touring post-war France, and he's picking up Matisses and Cézannes and Picassos. You know, Irving bought cars, Keynes bought modern French art, and you know, they're just men of different tastes. Although I suspect that the art has delivered better returns than the cars. Although who knows? Who knows? 1923 Bugatti or whatever might also be worth something. Now, here's Keynes. He's investing. He's touring around Paris. He's buying these artworks. Things are going well. And then he receives a telegram. The telegram informs him that the economy of Germany is not necessarily developing in accordance with economic theory. This is the sort of thing that tends to happen. And they've been wiped out, which is awkward. So Keynes then writes to these friends and family members, and he says, sorry I lost all the money. Please give me more money, and I'll make it all back. And remarkably, they do. And he does. So now it's from 1922, 1923, Keynes has made a fortune, lost it, made another fortune, and now for an encore, he has a new investment wheeze. He is going, like Irving, he's going to go into equities. He goes to the fellows of King's College, Cambridge. He's also a fellow there. It's a centuries-old institution. And he says, look, chaps, the college portfolio is invested in extremely boring stuff, like agricultural land and UK government gilts. And what I suggest is that you hand it over to me, and then I will invest in commodities and equities, much more exciting. And as I think I may have mentioned before, Keynes is a very persuasive man. So they say, okay, fine, away you go, Maynard. And that's what he does. And he has a particular investment strategy. It's a bit different to Fisher's. Keynes' idea is he is going to call the ups and downs of the business cycle. And he is going to move in and out of cyclical and counter-cyclical stocks and commodities in accordance with this forecast of the business cycle. Now, this looks like the pretty plausible thing to do. If anyone's going to be able to do this, surely it's John Maynard Keynes. Remember, he is revolutionizing macroeconomics, he's revolutionizing economic statistics, he is the quintessential insider. I mean, this really happened, okay? Phone goes on Keynes' desk, Keynes picks up the phone, Now, it may not. Bank of England here, just thought you'd like to know, interest rates going up tomorrow, there's a good chap. Okay? That's the kind of phone call you get if you're John Maynard Keynes. And by the way, I should say legal at the time, but nevertheless kind of handy. Okay? So Keynes is going to call the business cycle, and he is going to be in and out of different cyclical and counter-cyclical stocks in accordance with this formula. Right. So then we have our two heroes. John Maynard Keynes, Irving Fisher, 1928. And of course, what neither of them know is they are standing on the brink of an economic precipice. There's a huge crash coming in British stocks, and then shortly afterwards, the Wall Street crash. And the Wall Street crash, as I'm sure many of you know, was a proper crash. 89% off the value of stocks in nearly 4 years. 89% off. None of this rubbish Lehman Brothers stuff, like a real stock market crash. And they didn't see it coming. And then came the Great Depression, and they didn't see that coming either. And these are the two greatest economists of their generation, faced with the most important financial and economic event of the generation. And they miss it. They completely miss it. Now, this may not come as a surprise to some of you, because you've met economists, right? Economists like me. And you've seen how economists forecast things, and you've seen that these forecasts don't always go that well. And it's not just stories of Fisher and Keynes, and it's not just Her Majesty the Queen complaining at the London School of Economics that no one seems to have seen the financial crisis coming. I mean, there's lots and lots of evidence built up over the years. So a couple of guys at the International Monetary Fund periodically publish a survey of how forecasters from public and private sectors have done in this very tricky business of predicting turning points. So when there's a recession, do you see the recession coming? And they found that, I think I may have this right, that in 57 different recessions that took place across the world in 2008, the consensus forecast missed all 57 of them. Which, although I have to say, they did make up for lost time. So in 2009, I think they predicted 18 recessions that didn't happen. So, you know, on average, that's not too bad. But you know, we know this. We know that economic forecasting seems to be something that is not easy, especially not for economists. Now, but for those of you who were paying attention to the forecasting business, actually the event that I think really shook people's confidence in forecasting was not 1929, and it wasn't 2007, 2008, and it wasn't the publication of this IMF stuff. It was 2005. And you might be wondering, well, what happened in 2005? In 2005, a book was published called Expert Political Judgment. How good is it, and how do we know? And it was published by a psychologist called Philip Tetlock. And Tetlock had been fascinated by this question of forecasting for decades. So in the 1980s, he'd been interviewing lots of Russian specialists, so historians and sociologists and regional specialists and Russian speakers, academics and diplomats and think tankers and spies, all kinds of people. Been interviewing them about how the Cold War was going to end, if the Cold War was going to end. Ronald Reagan was being very assertive. Was that going to end in tears, or would that in fact force the Soviet bully to back down? And what Tetlock found was half the people he spoke to thought it was a terrible idea, and half the people he spoke to thought it was a brilliant idea. And that may not seem quite that surprising, right? Because you watch the television, you listen to the radio, people are arguing about stuff all the time. You're constantly seeing experts disagreeing with each other. And actually, if you think about it in a media-savvy way, I'm sure you'll realise that this is manufactured, right? They have to get two people to argue with each other because that's the way TV works, right? But this wasn't TV. This was properly trying to understand the most important issue in the world in the 1980s. And Tetlock had spoken to the leading scholars, the very, very best people, and half of them were wrong. He didn't know which half at the time, but he knew that half of them were wrong. And this was rather disturbing to Tetlock, who was a very thoughtful man. And so he began this epic project of interviewing experts, up to 300 in the end, from all sorts of fields, Some were economists, some were political scientists, some were sociologists, some were academics, and some were non-academics. He interviewed all these people, and he asked them to make forecasts, because he said to himself, the ability to make forecasts is at least one way that we can rigorously test at least a certain kind of expertise. Now, the clever thing about Tetlock's forecasts, there were two clever things. One was all the forecasts were quantifiable. So, you know the kind of forecasts we tend to hear is that, well, Angela Merkel will run into political difficulties over her decision to admit refugees to Germany. It all sounds very reasonable, and then you think, well, hang on a minute. What do you mean by political difficulties? All politicians have political difficulties all the time. I mean, are you saying that she is going to lose her job? Okay, well, that's at least more specific. But even then, all politicians lose their jobs, eventually. So, by when? So Tetlock, in every case, he said, I want a specific forecast that after the fact, there's a deadline, and after the deadline, we can say, yes, that forecast came true, or no, that forecast did not come true. That is a classic Tetlock forecast. There's none of this kind of wiggle room and, oh, I was nearly right, or yeah, that was... There was no argument. Your forecast was right, or your forecast was wrong. And he collected a lot of forecasts. He collected nearly 80,000 separate predictions from his 300 experts. And he did one other thing that I think was absolutely brilliant and very simple, which was that he waited for 18 years. And so at the end, when he publishes this book in 2005, he has this amazing data set about the forecasting record of all of these people and all of these different subjects. Some of them are macroeconomic, some of them are geopolitical, some of them are domestic politics, all this data. And it's a great book, I do recommend you read it. I am going to summarise it, and my summary will be a little bit of an oversimplification. But basically, the summary is as follows. London Zoo is, I think, that way, and if you want to forecast, get yourself a chimp. They are a lot cheaper than most experts, and they're just as good. They really are. So, with that, and then following that, Nassim Taleb publishes The Black Swan, there's a financial crisis, and people just seem to give up on the possibility that economic forecasting, or any of this kind of complex macro forecasting, people give up on the idea that it's possible. Of course, we still demand forecasts, right? But we demand forecasts like we demand Pringles. Like, we know they're not doing us any good, but we still want them. Thanks very much. But there was actually one person who continued to believe that forecasting these complex issues might be possible. And that person was Philip Tetlock himself. So he had seen one thing in his data that made him curious, made him want to follow up. And so he began yet another project, an even bigger project. This time he crowdsourced expertise. Anybody who wanted to sign up could sign up. Tetlock's now got, I think, over 20,000 forecasters signed up, making the same specific, quantifiable forecasts. That you can go online and you can update your forecast every single day. You want to adjust your forecast that the UK will vote to leave the European Union. You can adjust that every day if you like. And you will be judged when the decision comes and the UK leaves or does not leave, you will be judged on the accuracy of your forecast over that amount of time. Did you get it right? How right did you get it? And how early did you get it right? And with this enormous data set, Tetlock was able to divide people into different groups and to run experiments, and people got different kinds of training, and sometimes people were working alone, sometimes they'd work in teams, sometimes they'd get access to betting markets, that kind of information, they'd get to see what other people thought. Other times they were allowed to confer with each other, other times they were working in complete isolation. They took IQ tests and personality tests and all sorts of the kinds of tests that psychologists give people. And Tetlock again came out with another book, publishing his conclusions, and the book was called Super Forecasting, which I think hints at what he discovered. He discovered that there are a small number of people who are actually pretty good at this. And it's not a fluke, because the super forecasters, as he calls them, it's a slight exaggeration, I'll get to that in a second. But the super forecasters were just good for a year or 2 years. They actually got better and better and better relative to the typical forecasters. They got a lot of these calls right. And when they got them wrong, they tended to know in advance that they weren't very certain about it. So one of the ways in which you get to be a super forecaster is to express your correct forecasts with confidence, but when you're not sure, you say in advance, I'm really just guessing on this one. That, by the way, is how the chimps beat the experts. The chimps are rubbish forecasters, but the experts are confident rubbish forecasters. So the chimps beat the experts on that. But the super forecasters, they're pretty good, and they're also appropriately modest. So, what does it take? What's the trick? How do you get to be a super forecaster? Well, there are a bunch of different things. It's not IQ. It's not technical training. It's not access to secret data. There were CIA people on TEDx's list. In fact, the whole thing was funded by the US intelligence services. It wasn't any of that. It was partly, and this is very simple, it was partly that TEDx was keeping score. And that meant that if you actually cared, which most people don't, you could go back and look at your forecasts from yesterday and last week and 6 months ago and review and say, well, where am I going wrong and what am I doing right? But that keeping score is no good if you are not willing to evaluate your own performance. And here's the crucial thing about super forecasters. They're tremendously self-critical people. TEDx himself, I think, is a very self-critical person. So TEDx gives them these various personality tests, and they're not particularly extroverted or introverted or left-wing or right-wing or optimistic or pessimistic, none of that. But the super forecasters, they are open-minded. So the way a psychologist measures open-mindedness, you've got this questionnaire, and you're asking these questions, and there are things like, do you think it's a sign of weakness to change your mind? If you're running for political office in the United States, it is a sign of weakness to change your mind. If you're a super forecaster, no. You relish the opportunity to change your mind. Or do you enjoy meeting people who disagree with you? See, for most of us, it's no fun to meet people who disagree with us, unless, of course, we can crush them and demonstrate our superior intellect. But for the super forecaster, the absolute opposite is the case. They want to meet people who disagree with them, because the people might crush the super forecaster, and then you learn something. So every time someone disagrees with you, for a super forecaster, it's an opportunity to learn. Now, let's face it, most of us like to think that we have these qualities, but we don't actually have these qualities, because these are very strange qualities to have. That self-criticism, that constant looking for a second opinion. But the super forecasters have it. And that's why they do well. But that, I think, brings us back to the strange case of Irving Fisher and John Maynard Keynes. Because here's the curious thing about Fisher and Keynes. Now, they both completely failed to see the Wall Street crash coming. They both failed to see the Great Depression coming. But Irving Fisher died near bankrupt and his reputation utterly shredded, disgraced, by his forecasting failure and nothing else. John Maynard Keynes, on the other hand, died a millionaire. So what explains the difference? Very simply, the difference between Fisher and Keynes, after their failed forecasts, John Maynard Keynes changed his mind. But then the question is, well, why? Why did Keynes change his mind and why did Fisher not? So it's partly a case, I think, of character. I think it's partly also a case of context. So let me tell you about the context. So Fisher's forecasts were made with a tremendous amount of publicity. Everybody was following what he was doing. To the extent that a lot of people who know exactly one thing about Irving Fisher, and if you know exactly one thing about Irving Fisher, are willing to bet that it is the following thing, which is that 2 weeks before the Wall Street crash, Irving Fisher said on the front page of the New York Times, stocks have reached a new and permanently high plateau. You cannot back down from that. And Fisher was so associated with this idea of the boom, of the long boom in stocks, the idea that everybody should borrow and get in, that one critic afterwards blamed the Wall Street crash on the president, the Treasury Secretary, and Irving Fisher. That's how famous he was. Keynes, on the other hand, in a very different situation. He was making his forecasting failures in private. He was investing on behalf of King's College, Cambridge. He was running a mutual fund as well, but it was much more private. And here's another thing. Keynes had failed before. He'd failed with his currency fund. And actually, his stock picks and commodities picks in the 1920s, they weren't that great either. He was underperforming the market by about 18% across the 8 years in the run-up to the crash. He's not brilliant, and he could see it wasn't brilliant. And he could see, therefore, that he needed to change, whereas Fisher, who's making these leveraged bets, is outperforming the market because that's what leveraged bets do. So Keynes knew he had to change. He didn't change before the crash. He didn't see the crash coming. When it came, he was psychologically ready. It is, I think, a lot to do with how invested you are in your own ideas. And there's a remarkable story, this is nothing to do with Fisher or Keynes or economics, remarkable story from the 1950s when a group of people, a cult called the Seekers, gathered together in Chicago because they expected that at midnight aliens would come and take them to the planet Clarion and then at dawn they'd destroy the world. And of course these things happen, cults fall from time to time and they make these apocalyptic predictions, but what was interesting about the Seekers was in this particular case, a psychologist called Leon Festinger, the guy who invented the idea of cognitive dissonance, Festinger was there. Festinger had infiltrated a cult and he wanted to observe what happened. And so let's think about what happens when the aliens don't come at midnight. Spoiler alert, by the way, the aliens didn't come. Sorry to get that over with. What happens when the aliens don't come? So one view is, you've got people who are kind of curious, they're on the fringes of the cult, they're interested. And then you've got people who are totally committed. So these are people that have taken the clips off their bras or they've taken the zips off their trousers because the aliens don't like metal. They have left their husbands or wives, they have given away all their money, they have quit their jobs, everything. They're totally committed to this idea. So one view is, they're the people who feel most betrayed and most angry. They will kick against the cult most violently. But Festinger didn't think that would happen. Festinger instead came up with this idea that because they were so invested in the idea, so committed to the idea, they left themselves no room for manoeuvre. They would find a way to embrace their previous beliefs even more strongly when they were challenged. So what happened? Midnight, the aliens don't come. Everyone's sitting around stunned. They're checking the clocks, turns out one clock's a bit wrong, so maybe the aliens are looking at the other clock. The aliens still don't come. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. At about 4:30 in the morning, the cult leader, Dorothy Martin, puts her head in her hands and begins to weep uncontrollably. And everyone, they're shocked, they're looking around. Of course, the people who were just on the fringes of the cult, they've long since gone. Yeah, I was there, I never even did it anyway. Then, Dorothy Martin, surrounded by the inner circle, she takes out a pen, and with her hand shaking, she announces, aliens are sending her a message. She begins to write, and the message is that because of the faith shown by those people in that place, the aliens will not be destroying the earth. And the amazing thing is, this cult, which by the way still exists, this cult believed her, and they got really evangelical. So they started sending out press releases, they'd go out into the street, tell people good news. Great news, the world hasn't ended. Before their beliefs were completely disconfirmed, they were quite private about them. After they were shown to be a bunch of complete idiots, that was the moment they wanted to change the world. Festinger was right. And that, I think, was the position that Irving Fisher found himself in. Utterly committed, publicly committed to his forecast. He couldn't back away. So just to give you an idea, the Wall Street crash took 3.5 years, and Fisher was buying all the way down. So, for example, those shares in Remington Rand, they were $58 at the beginning of the crash, $28 after 3 months. At $28, Irving Fisher, he's still borrowing, and he's still buying. They were $1 by the time the market hit the bottom. That is how to bankrupt yourself, and that is how to ruin your reputation. Meanwhile, John Maynard Keynes, very quietly changed direction, adopted what we're now associating more with a sort of Warren Buffett style, value investing, strong cash flow, good management, buy and hold, and over the 25 years of his investment career with King's College, Cambridge, even including those early years where he did poorly, he outperformed the market by on average 6% a year. So he did just fine. So that's the power of context. But I also mentioned that these men have different characters. Now, Irving Fisher was a man who believed the world was ruled by numbers. He believed that fundamentally, if you gathered enough data and you thought hard enough, you could see into the future. Now, technical super forecasters have always believed there's no one way to see into the future. There's no certainty in life. You've always got to ask yourself, am I wrong? Is there another perspective? What am I missing? And that's something that Keynes had in spades. So there's this famous passage in the General Theory of Money, of interest in money, where he says, he's talking about long-range forecasts, and he says about the price of copper 20 years hence, or the prospect of European war, about these matters, there is no scientific basis on which to form any probability whatsoever. We simply do not know. And I think that really helped him make better forecasts, but just as importantly, helped him recognise when his forecasts were going wrong and he needed to change. Keynes, as I said, died a millionaire. Fisher died in poverty within a few months of each other. And Keynes's last words allegedly were, "I should have drunk more champagne." But he's more famous for allegedly saying something. It's not clear he ever really did say it, but he lived it. When the facts change, I change my opinion. What do you do? I wish he'd had the opportunity to teach that lesson to Irving Fisher. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed. Fascinating. But I won't tell you more economist jokes. But I did hear one about economists have forecast 9 of the last 5 recessions. So he took that away from me. There you go. A slap wrist for me actually. I should have, when I come back, said to remind that some people have come in and haven't got feedback forms. So it's really important to get feedback forms. So please do grab those on your way out when the event finishes, or a coffee break, etc. is really important. Our next speaker, Colin Driver from Keynes Capital, a company we know well, and we rate a number of your funds and recommend them, is going to discuss about the Diversified Growth Fund, and a subject also I know that a lot of advisors are close to is whether or not you take income from capital, or indeed whether you take it from income and the probabilities around sequencing this. So that's what we do. Over to you. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think there was actually some very useful investment lessons from Tim's speech there. I mean, one certainly is you always have to recognise that the future is just a range of possible outcomes, and it's very important, certainly, when anyone's making any investment decision, that you recognise the uncertainty around that. I think another point actually that you've made, which really sort of rings true, is that clinging on to 1 or 2 single bad investments can be enough sometimes to actually wipe out 7 or 8 very successful ideas. And it's just very much the idea that emotionally, if somebody gets attached to something, it can be a difficulty to move on from that. And certainly we're fully aware of that at Keynes Capital when we sort of discuss, debate, and form investment opinions. What I want to do this afternoon is just sort of very briefly sort of touch on some very sort of big picture investment related issues which I think are relevant to all of us. I'm then going to briefly talk about diversified growth strategies, a form of multi-asset investment strategy. What are they trying to achieve? And then finish up just touching on where we see some fairly attractive investment opportunities in the here and now. This slide effectively sort of sums up, or at least attempts to sum up, the implications of pensions freedom. And you'll probably know a lot more about that than I do, but certainly the impact of this is that individuals are getting more choice and more control, but with that comes added levels of risk in terms of investment return, in terms of inflation risk, and also in terms of longevity. For anybody sort of looking to use these full freedoms, an income solution is very often going to be one that's appropriate to them, and I think we've probably heard quite a lot about that earlier on in the day. For sort of some lucky few who are not looking to max out on income straight away, then some sort of growth-related solution or a combination of the two may well be more appropriate. And as I said, I'm going to talk about growth. This chart here shows you 20 years of gilt yields, and it's actually just worth pointing out after what Tim was talking about in terms of economists' forecasts. If you've gone back over this 20-year period, most economists and investors actually have constantly been forecasting that they're going to rise, and as you can see, they've consistently gone down in a sort of never-ending downward direction. Two observations about this. Now, one is a sort of very blatantly obvious one, which we're all aware of, and that is any sort of buy and hold investment strategy in fixed income, which you commit your clients to these days, is guaranteeing extremely low returns, and these kind of lifestyle type strategies are just allocating more and more money into ever decreasing returning investment strategies. There is, I think, a second very important point to be aware of from this, and that is that, if you look historically, when bad things happen in the world, bond yields typically fall quite dramatically, and that means that bond prices rise. If you've got a multi-asset portfolio with equities and bonds, that typically means that your bonds are helping you out when your equities are struggling. Now, very clearly, going forward, the potential for sort of dramatic capital gains in fixed income markets is significantly less than it was, and that is a challenge for a lot of traditional sort of multi-asset investment approaches. I'm going to touch later on how we sort of think about that and how we think we can potentially avoid that problem to a certain extent. This is a chart of equity returns over the last 20 years. They've certainly not been great over the last couple of years, but look, having said that, equities are still a very attractive asset class over the long term in terms of their performance. The problem that we all know is that it's actually possible to invest in equities for a multi-year period and get very, very poor returns. And had you been unfortunate enough to have invested in equities, let's say late 1990s, with a 10 or more year time horizon, you could have been taking your money out of the market after those 10 years having actually lost money. So diversified growth strategies are simplistically trying to achieve that sort of long-term trend return from equities, but trying to deliver it in a much smoother fashion, not without any drawdowns, but certainly with a sort of lower level of drawdown and a sort of lower level of volatility than you would get if you were in equities. Just before moving on, I think inflation is just something I really want to highlight. I think this is actually a very important point. We all at the moment sort of live in a very disinflationary environment. I think we're all aware of that, and increasingly I think the sort of consensus is that that's something that's going to continue into the indefinite future. If we do go into another recession with interest rates around the world at virtually zero, with none of the QE having been unwound, it's not realistic to expect interest rate cuts and more QE to get us out of that recession whenever it comes. Policymakers are going to have to come up with another new sort of radical policy. QE used to be radical, it's not anymore. That's part of the mainstream sort of policy toolkit. Now, a lot of fairly mainstream and well-respected economists are increasingly sort of talking about increased government spending directly sort of financed by central banks as the next sort of policy action which is going to have to take place. The headlines are grabbing sort of description of this is helicopter money. Adair Turner, sort of former chairman of the FSA, who's sort of very well respected, refers to it as overt monetary finance. And I think that sort of tries to give it a slightly more sophisticated sort of sounding, but ultimately it's going to be sort of throwing money at a failing economy. Now, that is likely to have a short-term impact in terms of growth. Importantly, it will also have an impact on inflation. You just think the Bank of England did about 375 billion of QE, and by their own estimates, they managed to boost growth by about 1.5%. The payment protection sort of refunds, PPI, I think there was about 22 billion of refunds sort of paid out by the banks. That actually had a sort of very similar impact on economic growth compared to QE. So I think it's reasonable to expect that a relatively small amount of money being targeted at individuals with a high propensity to consume will have an impact on growth, and it will have an impact on inflation. So anybody with a time horizon beyond the next sort of 2 to say 5 years has to think that inflation is a risk. It is something which could hit us again at some stage. Okay, very briefly, traditional approach to multi-asset investing is something which you would probably most commonly know as a sort of balanced fund, typically 60% equities, 40% bonds, something like that. The attraction of these is that they're diversified, and that means they're sort of less risky than a sort of single asset class that like equities. The drawback is that these types of funds do tend to be managed against benchmarks or against peer groups, and that always means that the manager, whenever they make an investment decision, are referencing what other investors are doing. So if they're buying more equities, more often than not, it's because everyone else has already gone out and bought more equities. They're not necessarily doing it because they think it's the right thing for the end investor in the fund. Diversified growth funds, it's a phrase which was sort of coined in the mid-2000s to sort of describe a sort of new, sort of more modern approach to multi-asset investing, which is effectively a sort of outcome-focused approach. These funds are typically looking to generate a return that's sort of in line with the long-term return of equity. So they might define that as LIBOR plus something, or inflation plus something, and with much less return, much less volatility than equities. Now, these have proved to be very popular with institutional investors over recent years. A lot of money has sort of moved into these, and there's an increasing sort of demand and interest from a sort of broad range of investors over recent years. One advantage of these over sort of more traditional multi-asset funds is that they do tend to invest in a broader range of asset classes. They can be quite active in terms of their asset allocation, and they typically have a very sort of strong focus on risk management and sort of thinking about how they can sort of contain drawdowns and losses, which is clearly important for many investors. It is worth mentioning though that they are not immune from drawdowns, and there are a lot of different approaches which managers can take. Now, that means from your point of view, it can be difficult to compare different strategies because different managers are very often trying to do sort of things in a very different way, sometimes using a lot of derivatives, and that can make them sort of quite complex to actually understand, what is it I'm investing in here. Now, to try and understand them further, sort of institutional consultants do tend to sort of try and bucket them into one of three categories, which I've sort of listed here, and that can range from sort of things which are sort of highly flexible in terms of their asset allocation to ones which are really sort of trying to take a more sort of absolute return type approach, and that is generally sort of very derivatives heavy. Now, there's a snapshot of 27 funds here from a certain point in last year, and as you can see, just from looking at their equity weighting, there is no common sort of equity allocation across these. So, one thing I would certainly say is you do have to understand what's actually underneath the bonnet when you're investing in these things, because two different DGFs could be doing two sort of very different things. A list of possible asset classes which they could invest in. The ones on the left are probably what you would see in a more traditional multi-asset fund, and the ones on the right, there's a broad sort of range of alternative opportunities there. As I've said, derivatives could be a small part, or they can dwarf the overall kind of size of the portfolio. I think one thing to also be aware of, is the manager effectively just trying to pick up market betas by investing in futures, etc.? Are they investing in a sort of bespoke portfolio of stocks, or are they actually sort of taking a sort of fund-to-fund approach? And a fund-to-fund approach is going to add certainly to the overall sort of expense load of the fund. So what I would say is these are the sort of questions that you should be asking if you're sort of considering one of these types of strategies. So this is a sort of standard sort of risk return chart with the risk measured by sort of price volatility along the bottom and the returns on the left-hand side. Ideally, you want to be right up in the top left-hand corner. Realistically, that's not very achievable, but getting into that sort of top left quadrant certainly is. And a sort of diversified growth fund would typically be seeking to combine some of these better performing assets in such a way that they're able to get the volatility or the risk down, because these different assets do tend to move around in different ways over time. Now, can you have too much diversification? I would argue from just sort of simply looking at this that the answer is yes. It's certainly nice to blend different assets which move around differently, but ultimately there's no point in simply seeking poorly performing assets just because they've got a lack of correlation with other investments. So, I mean, our approach is most certainly we like to find diversification wherever we can, but we invest in assets where we believe they actually stack up in their own right in terms of individual sort of risk return characteristics. This is how a number of sort of DGFs would sort of typically try and explain their sort of risk allocation and how they think about sizing in the portfolio. So each block here represents an individual strategy or an individual component within a fund, and the size of each block represents the individual amount of risk which is contributing to the overall risk within the portfolio. Add all of these blocks up and you get to something like a sort of gross risk number, which looks as if it's probably about 13 or 14%. That's quite a high number, and that's actually sort of quite close to the level of equity market risk. Please ignore that green dotted line. Equity market risk is around the sort of 13 to 14% level. Now, I think there's been some chat earlier on about, is it more difficult to diversify these days? Is there a sort of is there too much correlation in markets? Well, I would say correlation amongst asset classes has certainly increased in recent years, particularly since the financial crisis. But I think, as you can see here, there's a very sort of significant diversification benefit, and that's pulling the sort of overall risk profile of this particular asset allocation down to something which is about half that of overall equity markets. So, is it possible to find diversifying assets? Is it possible to reduce your risk in the current climate by combining a range of different asset classes? I would say the answer to that is definitely yes. Okay, so I said I would sort of talk about where we see some investment opportunities at the moment in the fund I manage. There's probably slightly more than 15 different independent strategies which we're currently running. The good news for you is I'm not going to talk you through every single one of these. I'm going to touch on a couple. We live in a world where income is very scarce, and we live in a world where growth is very scarce. And I think a lot of people these days are chasing income and looking for sort of dependable income strategies because of that sort of scarcity of income. And I don't dispute that, and we think that's a sort of very, very valid strategy in the current climate. But it's also worth remembering that although we live in a low-growth world, we don't live in a no-growth world, and there are a small number of businesses out there which are still capable of generating sort of very attractive, dependable sort of rates of growth. And in our view, these types of assets, when growth is scarce, are highly attractive in this environment. Now, the downfall of many equity growth investment strategies is that they generally involve identifying stocks that were very clearly yesterday's winners, paying a very high price for these stocks, and then all too often some of these stocks become tomorrow's losers. An approach which we've sort of taken in this strategy here is to very much sort of focus on change as a sort of warning sign of when things are going ex-growth, and if we sense that something is going ex-growth, it is immediately removed from the portfolio. To give an example of that, if a stock's growing at, let's say, 15% a year, that's a very attractive rate of growth in the current environment. It would probably be in a number of sort of equity growth strategies. If that stock had been growing at 16 or 17% 1 quarter ago or 2 quarters ago, we've got a quantitative sort of screen here which would very quickly pick that up, and that stock would instantly effectively be removed from the portfolio. So this is a strategy which effectively looks to avoid the sort of, the pitfall that many sort of equity growth investors can make. It's sort of fairly simple, but very sort of strong quantitative foundation, and also we don't look at market benchmarks when we're running this strategy. We don't see any point in investing in any sort of big name that you've heard of simply because it's in an index. Every stock that's in this sort of strategy, it stands there on its own merits. Now, there's a number of sort of alternative asset classes which we invest in and which we like a lot. I've got an example here. Infrastructure is a very well sort of known alternative asset class. It does actually cover a sort of very broad range of investment opportunities. As you can see there, toll roads, airports, communication towers, oil pipelines, that kind of thing. And the ones in that sort of larger orange circle are ones that typically a lot of very sort of large-scale infrastructure investors would invest in. Now, these are very often very attractive investments in their own right, but a number of them actually do have an element of economic cyclicality. If you think about a toll road in Mexico, the number of cars driving through that is going to be a function of how well the Mexican economy does. Now, that economic cyclicality to us actually makes them look very much like equities, because a lot of risky assets, like equities, typically have economic risk embedded within them. So from that point of view, interesting as these types of investments may be, you're not getting this sort of diversification benefit which we're looking for, and that's these kind of investments, for all that they might sound alternative, are not going to help you sort of bring down the overall level of risk within a portfolio. There's a sort of much smaller, sort of less sort of talked about area of infrastructure, and that's referred to as sort of social infrastructure or PFI, private finance type initiative investments, where effectively a private investor would agree with the government that we're going to build and finance a school, for instance, and you're going to pay us over a 20-year period for this. Now, to us, what's attractive about that kind of thing is it doesn't have any economic cyclicality. You've got a contractual revenue stream that's coming from a government body, so it actually does look a bit like a safe bond. And you're able to get a return of something like 5 to 6% from that, which in the current climate we view as highly attractive. These things are not risk-free. There are sort of specific risks tied up within them. If the boiler breaks down in the school, then you're going to incur a cost that's going to impact your returns, for instance. But the risks embedded with that are very different from the risks which are embedded with the sort of economic risks which are embedded within a lot of other more mainstream investments. We certainly like that. I've just listed here a number of different alternative types of investments which we particularly like. You may well be aware of some of them yourselves, but infrastructure, renewable energy projects, aircraft leasing investments. Each of these to us has got sort of very different return drivers from other things that are sort of going on in the fund. The performance of these is that orange line. And it's certainly not immune from drawdowns. You can lose money in these over a certain period of time, but the returns which they're capable of generating, in our view, are attractive, and they do tend to do it in a much more sort of stable fashion, which is something that we're looking to achieve, and ultimately I think something which your clients are all looking to achieve as well. Now, despite the fact that these things have performed well, a lot of that has just been simple compounding of the dividend over time, and the dividends, the yields that are on offer from these investments are still attractive, both relative to history and certainly relative to a lot of other investment opportunities out there. In terms of defensive investments, I'm just going to sort of finish off on this because clearly, as I said earlier, when things go wrong in equity markets, you want something which is going to protect you. And the problem with most government bonds is they're now priced to give you no protection. This chart here shows you all of the bonds that are outstanding, government bonds outstanding in the developed world. There are $27 trillion worth of them roughly, and each bar shows you how many are outstanding yielding more than a particular amount. So all 27 trillion of them currently yield more than -1%. And if you want to lend money to the Swiss government these days, you will need to pay them 1% a year for the privilege of doing that. And about 2/3 of these bonds are currently yielding more than zero. So, 2/3 still above zero, but it's not a particularly attractive rate of return. The thing which I find astonishing is that if you want to get 2% from a government these days, it doesn't sound like a big ask, but there's a tiny amount of bonds outstanding there which yield more than 2, and a fraction which are yielding more than 2.5. Now that's where we see the opportunity actually in terms of defensiveness. Like, as I said earlier, let's say we go into a recession in the next couple of years. If US interest rates are by that stage at 0.75% for the sake of argument, investors are going to be looking at these bonds on a 2.7% yield, which is effectively a sort of long-term interest rate forecast, and they're very going to quickly sort of reprice that from what the Fed can get up to 3% one day to the Fed is never going to raise rates again over the next 20 years. If that happens, these bonds are potentially going to give you a capital gain of something like 20 to 30%. And that would certainly be sort of very attractive in a scenario of extreme financial market volatility. So from a sort of, rather than using put options or whatever to protect our portfolio where we're having to sort of constantly write checks to try and ensure the value of it, by investing in these kind of bonds, we can pick up roughly 2.5% a year. It's not a great amount, but at least we're actually getting paid to take on that portfolio insurance. And the point I would make here is that actually, these are extremely scarce assets in the current investment environment. So there's a great sort of scarcity appeal of these types of investments. As you would expect, all of these, plus other things, are sitting inside our diversified growth fund. We're looking to achieve a return which is similar to the sort of long-term return from equities, and as you can see, that we're bang on track to do that. Certainly not drawdown free, but the drawdowns that we've experienced over sort of difficult market conditions are roughly half what you would have experienced within equity markets. So that equity-like return is there, with certainly a much lower level of sort of risk and a much lower level of drawdown than we would have got having been in equities. So to conclude, new pension legislation means that there's more requirement for solutions. Don't just think about income. Growth is also an attractive solution for many types of investors, and it's certainly a more attractive proposition than many sort of mainstream equity strategies, I would suggest. And if it sounds appealing to you and you're looking for a sort of low-cost solution, then you know where to come.
And so let's spend all that time in, and you were spot on. Thank you very much indeed. I took a few things away about inflation. We often forget about inflation, but even over a 20-year period, if we stick at 2%, your purchasing power is going to drop by 40%. The fact you feel what peers are doing and the relevance, and also very clear objectives. That's a theme we've seen throughout the day, and I think that can only be good for the end investor. We're running slightly over time, but we all do need a break, and we need a coffee to perk us up as well. So if I could ask you back no later than 15 minutes, that would be at just before 22. I'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much.